therapy is not a typical consumer category. Compare it with shoe shopping. You go to the mall, we all know what kind of shoes we like. When it comes to therapy, I mean, I think about my personal experience, my wife's experience. We had no idea. We didn't know what this kind of alphabet soup of therapeutic interventions meant. CBT, DBT, ACT, psychodynamic therapy. What are all of these letters and what do they mean for me and my personal experience and my mental health journey? I think that's where our system is failing people.
This is Second Opinion. I'm Christina Farr.
I'm Ash Sanuz. And I'm Luba Greenwood.
Welcome to the pod, where each week we navigate what's really going on in healthcare through strikingly candid conversations with the entrepreneurs and investors leading the charge. As your co-hosts, we promise to bring the perspective of a former journalist and investor, a doctor, a lawyer, immersed in the future of medicine with life sciences and digital health.
And we're here to sift the signal from the noise in all of these conversations. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. Make sure you stick around at the end of the interview for our debrief.
On the pod, we have Alex Katz joining us. He is the CEO of Two Chairs, and we're going to be talking about behavioral health, which is so topical at the moment because there is just such a massive distinction between the good companies that are trying to do the right thing by the patients and the providers and those that are not doing the right thing, as we saw with the news from Dunn. I believe the two founders are facing criminal charges for the dispensing of ADHD-related medications without proper oversight. So Alex, let's dig in. I'm just going to start off by asking you a question about why you think behavioral health has attracted such a wide range of founders. Because I think in this space, you truly see it all. You see those that are really mission-driven, and then you see the total opposite. So tell me why.
Yeah, well, first of all, Ash, Chrissy, thank you so much for having me on. I think back to when I started working on mental health, working on Two Chairs in the early days. This was kind of 2016, 2017. At that time, the set of startups focused on mental health were candidly few and far between. Most of them were kind of CBT apps trying to automate therapy. It was not a very active space. And I think in those first couple of years where I entered the fray, it was largely founders that were there for extraordinarily mission-driven reasons. And I think you fast forward to today, there are a lot of very mission-driven founders. This is a space that attracts people because the work is so darn personal. Like you talk to therapists, so many therapists entered the field because of their personal journey with mental health or because of friends or family members. But I think you're right at pointing at maybe there are some companies out there that didn't enter with such mission-oriented intentions. And I think that's because it's become a hot space. We have seen a lot of shift over the last several years in terms of diminishing stigma, extraordinary increases in demand for services. So I think that's driving a lot more venture capital to enter the space and therefore a lot more companies.
Alex, that's so interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about your own inspiration behind Two Chairs? What was the problem you were aiming to solve in this behavioral mental health space?
The thing that got me thinking about it kind of in the early days was basically watching my partner try to find a therapist in a time of need, simply put. And I think today that's a story we hear constantly. Back in 2015, 2016, that wasn't a story that was really being told publicly. And I think we had an interesting version of it. We were living in New York City at the time, the global capital of psychotherapy. My joke is you throw a rock, you hit a therapist when you're walking down the streets of Manhattan. We were both college educated. We had great health benefits. We have, parents that work in healthcare. Those were many, many advantages we had in entering that search. And it still was monumentally difficult. These are these moments, when folks are in the midst of a depressive episode or they've had a panic attack for the first time in their life. These are moments when our healthcare system should be at its most accessible, and it's often the exact opposite. And April's experience, ultimately, she did find a therapist, but 6 months into care realized this isn't right for me at all. It happened to be this was a psychoanalyst, and for specific reasons, that wasn't the right fit for her. So that was kind of got me thinking, okay, there's something about the fit in psychotherapy. And then I started doing research and realized I'm not the first person to have that intuition. It turns out there's decades of published research that has shown the therapeutic alliance is the best predictor of outcomes in care. And that kind of began me on the Two Chairs journey.
So just a follow-up question here. I think the number of therapists have exploded. We have all sorts of mental health professionals, behavioral health therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, licensed clinical workers, social workers, marriage family therapists, I don't know, many, many more. I think it's almost overwhelming now to figure out where to go and who's best suited for your needs, right? And the other thing I keep hearing about is people get pigeonholed into CBT because it's almost like they've found something that works. But a lot of the folks in the moms group, want to start with talk-based therapy. So how do you recommend, people, consumers navigate this landscape to figure out the right professional for their specific situation? And are there any red flags?
Yeah. I love this question. I find it fascinating. When I was starting to work on Two Chairs more than 7 years ago, that was the question that I was hearing all the time. It was, okay, there are a dozen different types of licensure. There are hundreds of different types of therapeutic interventions. It is so damn hard as a layperson to figure out what's the right type of care for me and how do I make my way to that care. You fast forward to today, billions upon billions of dollars of venture capital have entered the industry. We've seen an explosion in mental health startups. I think in some ways, it has never been this easy to find a therapist, right? You can go to betterhelp.com right now and get connected with a therapist extraordinarily quickly. But can you get to the right therapist? And I think your question is a good reminder that it actually hasn't gotten that much easier to find the right high quality care that's tailored to you. That's the question we've been obsessed about at Two Chairs now for many years. The process we take clients through begins with a 45-minute matchmaking consultation appointment with a licensed therapist whose entire job is to get to know you and figure out what are your preferences, what are your needs, and how do we distill that into the right characteristics of a therapist for you. And from there, an algorithm takes over. So we've been obsessed with this question. The result of our matching process is 97% of our patients tell us they're with exactly the right therapist for them. Look, I think if you're out there exploring the mental health system, trying to find care, certainly would recommend Two Chairs if you happen to live in Washington, California, or Florida. I think more broadly, if Two Chairs isn't an option for you, unfortunately, it's not an easy question to answer. And so I think the gold standard advice is to shop around. I think to your question, Ash, CBT is hot right now. Everyone's talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's actually not the right therapeutic approach for everyone. Ultimately, you have to feel like you're working with the right person, you're working in the right way. And so I think shopping around is the way to do it. Of course, what you're now saying to someone is you're depressed, you're struggling to get out of bed. Now we're going to ask you to shop around for therapists and tell that story to 3 or 5 people. That's a really big ask. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about how poorly our mental health system works today.
So I'm going to ask a related question then that is also a very VC question. So for those listening who aren't in VC, you may not have come across the term LTV to CAC. And this is something that consumer investors in particular obsess over. And it's the idea of like how much the CAC is, how much does it cost to acquire a customer? And LTV is, of course, the value of that customer over time. How long can you retain them? So to your point, Alex, when you're looking at a mental health business like yours, as a VC, you might like the idea of a patient that just sticks around for a really long time because you've got a long LTV. That patient's retained. But we've all been in experiences, I've certainly been there, where I'm just so done with that therapist. I've achieved the goals that I set out to achieve. And then it gets very awkward because they want to keep seeing you week after week and you're just mentally kind of moved on. So how do you think about that? Where on the one hand, you've got, this idea of measuring care and the match and the fit and actually reaching the goals that the patient has. And then on the other hand, you've got a bunch of VCs on the board that love the idea of a patient sticking around for a long time.
When we think about business model questions in the mental health industry, I like to start kind of, what does the clinical research tell us? Like, what is actually going to get people to the right outcomes? And then how do you build the business model from there? And I think the question about lifetime value raises a really interesting clinical question. Like, what is the appropriate length of care for different types of patients? What we know from the research literature is that, look, if someone's dropping out of care before session 4, therapy is probably not going to help them very much. Typically folks need 12 to 20 sessions of psychotherapy to really see the full benefit of it. On the other hand, research tells us that beyond that 20th or that 25th session, most folks aren't seeing much benefit from psychotherapy. If you're going to see benefit, you're going to see it by session 20 or session 25. There are, of course, exceptions, folks living with serious mental illness, for example. But for the vast majority of people seeking out therapy in a time of need, multi-year therapy isn't appropriate. We're not going to see additional clinical benefit. And so when we thought about designing our clinical programs at Two Chairs, that's really what we had in mind. We've got to design an experience such that we get folks to the right place so they stay in care. But then from session 1, literally session 1, we are talking to them about their goals for care and working backwards from graduation. Okay, so now to get to your question about lifetime value, early in my days of founding Two Chairs, when I talked to investors, they asked about LTV all the time and said, we want it to be as sticky as possible. We want it to last forever. And my mindset was, look, in the long run, we're going to build a health plan oriented business. In American healthcare, the vast majority of dollars flow through health plans. What do health plans want out of mental health care? They want great outcomes and they want it efficiently. They want patients to begin care and graduate once they see the benefit. And we knew if we can demonstrate excellent outcomes and efficient graduation, we're going to be very, very sought after by health plans. And that's the way to build the biggest possible business. So I think we're lucky. We've got a set of investors and a board that's super bought in on that thesis. We just wrapped up a Series C raise. I was actually really pleasantly surprised. I think VCs have gotten a lot more sophisticated in how they think about LTV. 5 years ago, it was, how do you maximize it? Today, it's, how do you deliver on an appropriate LTV that balances what's right for the health plan and is enabling you to create value for the health plan?
And maybe to the second part of the question on how much does it cost to acquire the customer, are you finding that because of the health plan focus that, things just, your cost of acquiring just comes down over time? Or are you still mostly attracting people through all the ways in which a consumer company would, where you'd have to find them on Facebook or find them, on the various kind of social apps that they use every day?
Yeah. I think I've had an interesting lived experience here because the first 3 years of Two Chairs, we were 100% out of network. We're a direct consumer model. So we were very reliant on advertising to consumers. And then over the last 3 to 4 years, we have evolved to be predominantly a health plan business. More than 97% of our patients are seeing us in network with their health insurance. And you can kind of compare and contrast those two experiences. Phase 1 of Two Chairs, CAC was high. It was expensive to acquire customers. Therapy is a journey that ends often in a tremendous amount of progress. It can be a life-changing experience, but kind of going through that journey is often painful. You're having to bring up trauma. You're having to talk about your depression. This is something that often takes people a while to work up the courage to seek out and to tackle. You compare that to where we are today, you take away that cost burden, and suddenly it gets a lot easier to say, well, I'll give it a shot and I'll see what happens. So, our approach has been, we're spending very few dollars on advertising, and we're very focused on referral-oriented channels. So the health plan, primary care providers, word of mouth, those drive the vast majority of our new patients coming into Two Chairs. And you contrast that with, some of those D2C telehealth businesses that are spending 30, 40, 50% of sales on advertising. That's not a very interesting business.
So just to kind of double click on that comment there, it's great that plans are picking this up, but we're still seeing, with all the increase in the number of providers that are entering the space, number of platforms for therapy, I think the statistics out there still show that more than half of the adults with mental illness are still not getting treatment, because I think there's a significant gap in access to mental health care. What are the barriers and what can we do here?
Yeah. I think historically, the biggest barrier was probably stigma. If you kind of rewind the clock by 10 years, the way that the average person thought about mental health, mental illness, therapy was quite different from the way people think about it today. And I think that added a huge amount of friction standing between people and getting to the right care for them. Today, a lot of that stigma has subsided. It's kind of hard to encounter pop culture and to not hear about therapy these days. And I think that certainly changed the national conversation in a big way. It's also gotten easier to find a therapist, period, right? I think the reason that isn't translating into as much access as we would like, and in particular, the right access, is that comment I made earlier. It is still so damn hard to find the right therapist for you. And I think most people, when they begin this journey of seeking out help, if we're being honest, they don't totally know what they're looking for, right? Therapy is not a typical consumer category. Compare it with shoe shopping. You go to the mall. We all know what kind of shoes we like. We go to shoe stores. I like that one. I like that one. I'll try that on. Great. I love what I just purchased. When it comes to therapy, I mean, I think about my personal experience, my wife's experience. We had no idea. We didn't know what this kind of alphabet soup of therapeutic interventions meant. CBT, DBT, ACT, psychodynamic therapy. What are all of these letters and what do they mean for me and my personal experience and my mental health journey? I think that's where our system is failing people.
Hey everyone, we'll get right back to the conversation after a word from our sponsors. Is your healthcare org a tangled mess of Christmas lights? Your care teams are drowning in manual work, juggling dozens of point solutions and burning out in Excel hell, while your engineers work through a backlog bigger than a surgeon's ego. Awell is here to untangle the mess. Their care ops orchestration platform lets ops and clinical teams design, implement, and improve care flows in days, integrated seamlessly with your tech stack. The result? Automated processes, fewer soul-sucking tasks, and faster care model improvements. This year alone, Awell has orchestrated over 14 million care activities for leading organizations like Astrana Health, Commons Clinic, and Better Health. Ready to save your team from Excel hell? Visit awellhealth.com. That's AWELL health.com. And mention this podcast for a free bootcamp. They'll take you from zero to an implementable workflow in 2 days or less. Awell, the AI-powered care ops platform.
What do you think about cost and insufficient insurance coverage? Is that still an issue? When I was reading up a little bit over the last week in preparation for this, it seems like that's a pretty high cost, and inadequate insurance still seems to be a major barrier to accessing behavioral health and mental health care. Is that what you're seeing on your end?
Despite parity laws, which we should touch on too. And Alex, I'd love to hear about your thoughts on like how much those have stacked up in the real world. Like, have we met parity?
Yeah. No, Ash, I appreciate it. That was the next place I wanted to go. So it's a great segue. Look, I think over the last decade, we have made progress. The Parity Act was passed back, I think, in 2008. So it's now been quite a number of years. And we have seen a step up in parity enforcement. I think that has helped. We also talk to more and more health plans every year that I think are waking up to the fact that, they have to comply with the parity law, but also by underinvesting in outpatient mental health historically, they've been shooting themselves in the foot. Investing in mental health care is, of course, the right thing to do ethically. People are suffering. If someone was in immense physical pain, we wouldn't say, don't reimburse care that will help them feel better. If it doesn't bend the cost curve, we would say that person's suffering. We should help them. The same applies to mental health care. But on top of that, there's a real financial incentive that I think health plans have begun to wake up to. There's now a lot of research that is consistently showing if someone has, for example, depression comorbid with diabetes, they are costing the health plan and the healthcare system dramatically more money than if they just had diabetes. So that is compelling more health plans to invest more in mental health care. We work with plans like Kaiser Permanente and Aetna that we really see as the forefront of thinking about mental health in a much more sophisticated way through a lens of measurement and quality and ultimately value. Now, if I said all health plans are thinking that way, I'd be lying. And I think that's where we've got real work to do as an industry over the next, say, 5 to 10 years, is getting the entire industry behind this idea that quality in mental health care matters deeply. So if you're a member of Kaiser, if you're a member of Aetna, I think you've got a network of mental health providers that's pretty exceptional, not just 2 Chairs. I think other providers they've brought into their network. I think with certain networks, you're leaving something to be desired. And yeah, are there technically folks that have availability? Yes, but there's not that much availability, and that makes it even harder to find the right kind of care.
Yeah, and to your point, Alex, I mean, I still talk with a lot of payers who feel that a lot of the behavioral health companies that have been venture backed are just adding utilization. And so they don't buy into the argument fundamentally that this is reducing cost, especially because it can be hard to track it in the claims. And what you're talking about is, more subtle and sometimes second order, and sometimes it's an ER visit that is actually related to a mental health condition, but looks like it's something else. And so the cost question, I think, is still up there for me. And sometimes I wonder, and I would love to hear what you think, should we be pushing digital health companies in behavioral health instead of pitching cost or a reduction in cost, pitch productivity gains, pitch member experience and customer satisfaction. And I mean that both for the payers and the plans, and also the large self-insured employers who I think really care about things like productivity losses. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first place my brain goes is I think what you're pointing at is right. Like, okay, there's a lot of digital mental health companies out there. And if you squint, they're all similar. They're all venture backed. They all have therapists. They all have software. But I think that misses a tremendous amount of nuance. And, Chrissy, you began the podcast talking about there are some companies that have crossed ethical lines. I think there's a whole spectrum in terms of the investment behind quality. And our perspective is, look, if you're effectively aggregating the existing private practice landscape of therapists, you're just aggregating the same system. You're not really changing the way that care is delivered. And when you look at data on the impact that therapy is having at a system level, it's not good enough. For example, when a patient begins therapy, only about a third of the time do they make it to a fourth session of care. That's a gigantic crisis, right? That means that 2/3 of the time, people have worked up the courage in the midst of a depressive episode, or they're suffering from PTSD, or they're having panic attacks all the time. They finally work up the courage. They start talking about it with a professional, and then within a week or two, they've given up.
That's
I mean, that hurts my heart.
Yeah.
I hope it hurts yours. Like, that is a crisis unfolding before our eyes. And I think it speaks to, if you just increase access to a generic network of therapists where there's not the right level of matching, not a commitment to measurement-based care, not a commitment to evidence-based practice, then who cares? You're just repackaging the same broken system. So that's really our mindset in terms of how we've built our clinical programs and how we talk to health plans. And you're also right, Chrissy, like, member experience matters, productivity matters, but we also have to remember the logic of the American healthcare system is strong, and it often orients around cost. And so I think if we're really going to drive the right orientation around measurement and quality as a mental health industry, we're going to have to get better at that cost argument. And the good news is we already stand on a bedrock of research that's pretty darn strong. That canonical finding that mental illness comorbid with chronic condition drives a ton more spend, that's been proven. And so we just need to show that differentiated clinical models are the ones delivering on that cost savings versus commoditized network.
Can you talk a little bit about youth mental health? I mean, with the rising social media culture, we hear a lot about increasing depression and other issues that are rising in America's youth specifically. Are you seeing increased utilization? Are you seeing barriers to care? Are you seeing insurance issues in this space? What are you seeing here?
Yeah. So, I think I'll say off the top, Two Chairs doesn't provide mental health care today for folks younger than 18. And I'm not a therapist, so I don't really have the expertise to opine here. I'll share a few thoughts. I think one thing I can share very concretely is when we talk to our health plan partners and ask them, what else can we do to better serve you and your member population? The number one thing they say is kids. That is the place where they are seeing the most profound access challenges. Look, I think we have a therapist shortage in this country. I think it's probably overstated, to your comment earlier, Ash. I think on the kids side, that shortage is much more acute. And look, you look at the data around, anxiety and depression rates amongst teenagers, for example, and it's hard not to be scared. I mean, the rates are just off the charts. And I think it's great that there is now a much more meaningful debate about what is driving that. I think it's great that Gen Z is dramatically more open about talking about this stuff than even myself as a millennial, certainly dramatically more than Gen X and older. I think that's the good news, but we've got a real challenge on our hands for sure. And I think there's a tremendous amount of work to be done.
Teenage kids, it's always top of mind for me.
Mine are super little, but it's something I think about a ton. And speaking of like teenage, you said 18, which is still young. I mean, that's really young. I may have thought when I was 18 that I was a grown up, but now I look back and I'm like, nope, barely out of diapers. So what are you seeing in Gen Z? This kind of 18 to 26 population, because you mentioned stigma a few times. You said that was the issue at the beginning when you got started. I feel like every time I pick up TikTok, all I see is Gen Z, chatting about the therapists that they've gone to see. It seems like this generation doesn't feel that it's a big deal to see a therapist, which is amazing. But then you also see lots of reports of suicide on college campuses, and there seems to be a rising epidemic there as well. So like, what do you think is kind of or maybe I'll ask a question differently. When you think about 2 chairs for adults, like the sort of, the people our age, and then you think about 2 chairs for like your 18 to 26-year-old population, what would feel different about the experience of anything?
I think what's interesting about the approach we've taken is, look, there's fundamental aspects of the experience that will feel similar to anyone, but ultimately it should feel extraordinarily personalized. And that first appointment where you're with a therapist whose entire job is to get to know you and guide you through a process of self-exploration, that should feel really personal. And what should come out of that appointment is a nuanced understanding of your needs, your preferences, and how that should shape your therapy journey. I think broad trends that I would say in terms of, Gen Z coming to see us versus millennials and folks that are older. I mean, one thing I can say concretely is, look, our population certainly biases Gen Z and millennial. We see folks, we have people seeing us with Medicare. So it goes all the way up to 80 plus. It's a wide range of ages. But certainly what's most common by far is folks that are Gen Z and millennial. And I think that speaks to the stigma is not there to nearly the same extent. People are very, very comfortable talking about it. And what I have found fascinating about the conversation around therapy on social media is I think it's starting to evolve in a big way. The last few years, therapy took over, right? Therapy culture has infused so many aspects of social media, TikTok in particular. I can't believe how many therapists have gone viral on TikTok. For a few years there, it was all about go to therapy, try therapy. Therapy will really help. Here are things I learned from therapy. What I'm starting to see more and more is a little bit of skepticism about therapy. I'm not sure I was with the right person, or I've been in therapy for 2 years. I don't feel like I'm seeing any benefit from it right now. Those kind of more nuanced questions, not blowing off therapy entirely, but asking the next question about, am I getting what I need and deserve out of this experience? To me, that's fantastic. Like going back to my shoe example, the average American consumer of therapy 5 years ago was extraordinarily uneducated. That's starting to change. We're starting to find consumers are more discerning about this is what I'm looking for. And I think that's really, really good. Now, the average person is still encountering a system that's too hard to navigate, too hard to find those specific parameters. But in a context like 2 chairs, we can actually satisfy, okay, you want a therapist who looks like you, shares lived experience, has a certain style in the room. Those are all things that we can incorporate into a match. And I think that's a really good thing.
Alex, how important do you think it is to have a hybrid model of care for therapy versus just the growing number of telehealth platforms that are just virtual only?
Yeah, in short, it's really important. Different people have different preferences for how they receive their healthcare. And I think we as a healthcare system have a big obligation to our patients to serve them in the way that they want to be served. I think taking a bigger step back, the pendulum keeps swinging on telehealth, right? I think 10 years ago, 7 years ago, pre-COVID, it was a lot of trust us, telehealth can work. And I think there was a lot of skepticism, from the industry, from patients. COVID hit. We were all forced into trying telehealth. And we realized, there's dramatically more people that would benefit from telehealth, especially for therapy, than we once thought. The outcomes are basically the same. But now we're seeing the pendulum start to swing a little bit. I think we're seeing, maybe for the majority of people, virtual therapy is not only right, it's better, but it's not better or right for everyone. And we're seeing a significant increase in patients that are coming to us saying, I really want to see someone in person. And so the fact that we're able to offer that choice is meaningful to the patient, and it's meaningful to the health plan, that's responsible for millions of lives. And they know heterogeneous populations that have diverse preferences, and they've got to figure out how to serve that. So I think in the kind of venture-backed digital health realm, look, Silicon Valley has often been kind of scared of stepping, into the physical world. But I think for this next phase of the evolution of the healthcare system, it's just going to be critical.
Okay, Alex, I'm dying to know if you had to share an idea for a potential founder listening into the pod who was thinking of starting something in behavioral health. What would be the idea that you'd throw out based on what you've seen building Two Chairs?
It's a great question. What's coming to my mind first is the opposite of your question, which is the company I wouldn't start right now. So maybe I'll start there and see if I think of an idea for what to start. The idea I wouldn't start is AI therapist.
Oh my God.
I'm having a lot of conversations these days with folks.
Oh my God. I'm hearing so many of these pitches. Yes. Tell us more.
Color me skeptical. Look, I think, to a computer science brain, therapy is just text that's being exchanged between two people. What does it matter if the other side is an AI that is, spitting out lines from a CBT textbook? That's got to work, right? I think it won't work. I think the research around psychotherapy has shown again and again, it kind of doesn't matter if you're using cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy or psychodynamic therapy. By far the best predictor of outcomes in therapy is the therapeutic alliance, the relationship between two human beings, building a trusting, healing relationship. That is the vector for change. And I'm really skeptical that, an AI is going to be able to do that. Maybe one day it will, but that kind of feels like a final frontier for AI basically displacing humans in a whole host of areas. If I were a really talented computer science graduate coming out of, Berkeley or Stanford right now, and you want to build an AI business, oh my God, you're going to be really successful. Just pick a different use case that isn't this challenging. So that's the one I think I wouldn't do. Look, I think there are applications for AI in mental health care and healthcare more broadly. Right now, we're excited and actively exploring notes and documentation as an area where we can enhance the productivity and the lived experience of therapists. I think that's really interesting. I think there's going to be potential for, could AI complement what's being done in the therapy room and extend the impact of therapy during, the other couple hundred hours a week that you aren't in therapy? I think those are potential applications. But I would advise...
Just a quick interruption here.
Please.
What do you think of these empathetic AI models where, I'm seeing a lot of these where they can, in the first 10 seconds or 30 seconds, tell you if somebody's depressed or et cetera, and call centers are now, considering these things. Do you think therapists will see these as co-pilots to them during therapy sessions, or is this something that's still yet to be, TBD on the space?
Yeah. We haven't experimented with those types of applications yet, so I can't say a whole lot in terms of practical lived experience. Part of your question was, how will therapists receive it? Adopting technology is not easy for therapists. I'll say that kind of plain and simple. Therapists have been through a ton of graduate school and training. They have specific ways of practicing that they've been doing for years. Adopting technology is not easy. This is a field that historically has had basically zero tech. In my early days of exploring Two Chairs, talked to lots of therapists in private practice, and they ran their entire practice on basically a yellow legal pad. We have found, for example, just the journey of getting our therapists really bought in and utilizing measurement-based care, that has been a 3 to 4 year journey. And that's because it is a big challenge. How do you incorporate that data into the room? How do you engage many different types of patients with many different types of presentations? So turning an AI into a true co-pilot, question one is like, what are the ways that it can actually be useful and add a complementary perspective to the therapist? And then second is, how long is that journey going to be of driving true adoption? We'll see.
Well, Alex, thanks so much for coming on the pod with us. It's been a real treat to have you. And, I totally agree with you too on AI. One of my favorite things to say right now is that I am long human being. So I think in the great fight between the actual real human therapists and the AI therapists, I think I'm on team human too. So we look forward to having you come back and join us anytime. It was really great to chat.
Awesome. Well, really enjoyed it. Thanks for all the great provocative questions, and look forward to next time.
Should we do our chat about Alex?
Yeah, what a great guest, Chrissy. Loved hearing from him. Really rooting for Two Chairs. What'd you think?
I thought he was fantastic. I loved what he said about how investors have become more sophisticated, founders have become more sophisticated in the past decade. I think sometimes we can fixate on the worst companies and, the decisions that got made when frankly, we just didn't know that much about the space and all the mechanics. And now he said when he raised his Series C that, nobody was asking him, we want the stickiest, longest retention possible, that things had changed. And it was much more oriented around what is the right level of experience, the right duration of treatment. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And I also, I thought it was a provocative point too, when he talked about the fact that the shortage of therapists, especially for adults, is not as stark as sometimes it appears, but that we just don't have good therapists necessarily. It's a good therapist problem, not just a therapist problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm really glad to see that the investment in mental health generally by the VC community has been substantial. I thought I saw some number around a few billions that have been invested each year. The demand and the innovation in the space, which is fantastic. But I was a little bit perturbed that there's still persistent barriers to access, like high cost and still struggling with insurance coverage. I think you mentioned the therapist shortage and having, teenagers of my own. I do worry about the social media impact and all the things. When I read things about increasing depressive episodes in kids, I'm like, we should be investing in the space more specifically than investing in getting therapists in the space that are more specialized. So I'm hoping that moving forward, we're going to have continued innovation and possibly policy changes that are going to make mental health more accessible to both adults and kids. So let's see, agree with you on being long human. I just don't think in this space you can just replace it with an AI therapist. So I was happy to hear from him that he's still TBD on that space. I do think that there are places where, maybe over time we'll see more adoption by therapists with the empathetic AI components. I do think AI can add value. I just don't think it can replace the therapist. No, I mean, I personally don't want to talk to a robot about if I went into therapy. So let's see what happens in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm long human because, yes, you can make an AI bot kind of somewhat good at active listening and repeating back things that people have said. And I think there are techniques that can be built there. But, we forget that computers can't respond to feedback that they're seeing in the real world. And, sometimes it's great just to experience speaking and having this feeling of someone listening. But sometimes you want to hear from somebody about life experiences that they've had that can mirror your own. And, there are vulnerabilities that I think human beings can express because of hard things that we've gone through that computers, frankly, have not gone through. And so to me, this just speaks to the sort of obsession we have with STEM and this obsession we have with data. And we forget that humans are these amazing, empathetic creatures that are continually evolving. And every time I hear
100%.
I'm like, guys, pick up some Shakespeare, like read a good book and remind yourself what is special about, this species that you come from. Like, we've produced some of the greatest pieces of art and literature that, it's unimaginable that a computer could ever do. So, human beings for the win. And thank you so much.
We like being around each other, right? I mean, that's why we're talking to each other. We want to be around each other. We're not talking to robots right now. So I hope, I'm all for humans too. Yay.
Okay. Well, that'll be a good topic for the next show. Thanks for joining me, Ash.
See you soon.
Thanks for tuning in to Second Opinion. Share it with colleagues and friends and message us to let us know what topics you want to discuss on the podcast. If you want to support the show, the best ways are to leave a review wherever you're listening and make sure you are subscribed. And check out Chrissy's Substack, Second Opinion. A link to subscribe is in the episode description. Second Opinion is part of Turpentines, the podcast network behind Turpentine VC, Age of Miracles, and more shows for experts by experts in tech.